Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm Lanny Keller from The Advocate, coming from the Advocate World Headquarters newsroom on beautiful Segan Lane in Baton Rouge, and I'm here with the two dazzling women who have done so much for this city and the state. Boo Thomas was founder of CPEX. And Camille Manning-Broome is president, I guess, and executive director, or whatever eminent title. And they are the people who are here to talk about CPEX then and CPEX now. Has there been a big difference in the two? And kind of our general thesis of the questions is how have things shifted, and what is our new agenda for the future? And so, if individuals wish to ask a question, they can do so through the Q&A function on Zoom. And if we can, we hope to get to them as soon as we chat. But after we talk, we'll try and get to questions. And even in the case we don't get to them, Landon Hester from the staff will have your email and can respond after the fact. And I understand this is going to be recorded and put out on YouTube subsequently. So Boo Thomas, who has been an extraordinary civic leader and gained national recognition for what you did with CPEX, and starting in Baton Rouge, but also subsequently across the state. You started out of the community development realm. And to some extent, is that really relevant nowadays, since we deal with such global and enormous challenges like climate change in today's world? And did you really think about it much in those terms when you started out?
Well, I can answer that part. No, I did not think about that much at all when I started out. And, this thing just popped into my head about that saying that all politics is local. Well, all planning, all flooding is local. All transportation issues are local. So as we began, when I did the neighborhood redevelopment in Mid-City, it was about people trying to get to know them. What did they need? What was holding them back? What could make their lives better? Well, that goes through every single thing CPEX has ever done and continues to do. So that's the foundation. And if you ever lose that vision, I think, then why are you doing what you're doing? So the other amazing thing is, as I read publications today, I see CPEX's footprint, and might be small, in so many of the projects that you see on the front page of the Advocate today, or in all of the social media about the LSU lakes, about the train, about, of course, climate change and adaptation. But I see that the very principles that we started with Plan Baton Rouge. In fact, I found a introductory notes of Plan Baton Rouge, which, remember, we completed in 1998. So many of those strategies apply to everything that CPEX is doing today. Pretty cool.
To some extent, I think that you could probably say that in the course of the Plan Baton Rouge work, you became more focused on green spaces and greenscapes. Davis Rohr, God rest his soul, who was lost in COVID, helped promote that in downtown Baton Rouge. But also across the state, a lot of places are looking into green spaces now. To some extent, is that kind of a bridge between what you sort of used to do, but you're also still doing today?
Absolutely. And I think Camille's influence in this has been amazing. But, when we were looking at plans after Louisiana Speaks, after the horrible hurricanes of 2005, Katrina and Rita, we began to see how important these green spaces were to hold water. And you began to look at rain gardens all over New Orleans. I mean, we have a few here in Baton Rouge, and green roofs, but things that would then hold the water. And so that has been incredibly important for the very people that need to deal with climate change in their daily lives. You know, climate change is global, but gosh, it's so local.
And to some extent, Camille, do you see that as has that lesson kind of been absorbed into the community planning and the planning process around the state? You have things like the Lafitte Greenway in New Orleans. You have there's a great deal of talk as Lake Charles recovers from Hurricane Laura to expand the green space, using water in a more intelligent way to deal with those crises. Have we absorbed all the lessons of those times? And really is as Boo pointed out, it was about getting to know your communities and in those days you had in the power structure, say Tom Sawyer and Baton Rouge General, for instance, working with you from the beginning. Those were an important push toward achieving your goals. The question is how much of that have we really absorbed into the landscape of planning and leadership in the state?
Yeah. So is your pun intended, Lanny?
Yes.
Because I don't
No,
think
actually,
that
I
we
don't.
have not absorbed all that we need to. You know, it's really fascinating to be able to look back over the last 15 years and see the paradigm shift. But we still have a ways to go. And so when you talk about living with water, New Orleans is definitely ahead of the game because they had the benefit of so many people and leaders in the area making partnerships with the Dutch, taking leaders to the Netherlands. The Office of Community Development provided funding for the city of New Orleans, led by David Wagner, to do the water plan. And you began to see people internalizing that and understanding, what that meant, but actually making it happen is a whole nother story. And so I think that New Orleans has created some movement forward, and even neighborhood groups are in the 7th Ward, led by Angela Chalk, figuring out how to capture water, install rain gardens, manage as much water on the site as possible. But has that concept and way of practice been absorbed across the state? Not yet. And I'll say, when I hit the ground as a planner right out of graduate school in Louisiana, it was in the aftermath of 2005. And when we got on the ground in communities to help them think about recovering and planning, I was constantly asked, are you an event planner? What kind of planner? And the reason is we're a high private property rights state. We didn't have a lot of population movement. So outside of the metropolitan areas, you didn't have a lot of planning. People were good neighbors. You didn't need to have, or communities didn't have a lot of regulations on the books. And so because of CPEX's work, the state's resources towards planning, there were 15 communities that had plans, parishes out of 64 in 2005. And there's been a paradigm shift towards planning across Louisiana. So I think when we start talking about green infrastructure and stormwater management practices, we have a very long way to go. And when we do that right, we're going to be digging up asphalt and pavement.
And Boo,
I wanted to add something. One of the questions that you asked, Lanny, I've been really pondering about leadership. And so when you have communities that have a transportation engineer in charge of their Department of Public Works, whatever you want to call them, is a very different outcome than those that have transportation planners. And so you can see the difference in New Orleans, and you see the difference when I remember us going to West Palm Beach and seeing, I never even knew the difference between the two. But it's also leadership at the top. And if you have a mayor that believes in this, and not a mayor that makes fun of people on bicycles, which we have had, and thank goodness for Sharon Weston Broome, she believes in it. She doesn't stop it. And Kip Holden was really a big advocate of that. And so it goes all the way to the state level as to who the Secretary of Transportation is and how much money they're willing to put towards these kind of green strategies. So,
Well, don't you think there was kind of a huge shift for you and CPEX as an organization in dealing with Katrina? Katrina is kind of an inflection point for the entire state of Louisiana in so many ways. But it hit your organization, of course, very strongly, because suddenly just things like people having wills so that that property could be dealt with. I recall y'all pushing that kind of agenda at a time when nobody was thinking about it.
And we did a survey and got something like 27,000 people to respond. Maybe not that many total, but asking them, where do you rank property rights? And that was right after Katrina. And 83% of all respondents said property rights were not as important as community protection. And we would laugh and say, well, then we had Gustav and Ike 3 years later. But I would just say, because we hadn't had a major storm for a while, those years after, you wouldn't have that same response. So it's really interesting how different. But our CPEX really was birthed because of Katrina and Rita. And because Governor Blanco and Andy Copland were in charge, they came to the Plan Baton Rouge staff to say, how can we plan better for the next 25 years? And that's how Louisiana Speaks was born. And, the Baton Rouge Area Foundation was the one that got all the funding for that planning. And the foundation has really had a hand in all of these things and been part of the progress that this state has made, and especially our parish.
And odds are that that would have been a very much an uphill discussion had there not been, frankly, the devastation of Katrina.
Oh, you'd have never had it.
Yeah.
Never.
Well, Senator Landrieu did allocate resources to CPEX, which allowed you to become your own independent nonprofit to replicate the Baton Rouge work you had done in other communities. And so that was irrespective of, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. So Boo would have established us, and we would have spawned out across Louisiana regardless, but to what degree. And that large tipping point for a call for planning and changes in land use practices would not have been there. So,
and that since Boo talked about the role of political leadership too, when Mary Landrieu was a senator, she said, you need to have a land use plan if you're going to get federal funding for various forms of coastal protection. That was a big incentive on the coast for people to say, we need to start thinking about these kind of things. And to some extent, it was kind of a hammer in a gentle bit of hammering on local officials to do it.
Yeah, you're talking about the bill where that was written into it. However, that wasn't followed. So, yeah,
it wasn't followed all the time, obviously. I think we should probably touch on the coastline, because to some extent we are building out now an enormous amount of infrastructure, when you call it a couple of billion for diversions and so forth. That's a huge amount of money that, but a lot of that is funded through the 2010 funding from the BP oil spill. That will go on for a number of years, but it won't go on forever. So how do you see the coastline going forward, and y'all's role too in that? To some extent, there is a larger and more dynamic government bureaucracy that is more into planning, called the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, than there was pre-storm. Is that well, that's useful, and we had coffee yesterday with Garrett Graves, who was director of that. But at some point, we're going to have to step up as a state and deal with the fact that there are a great many expenditures that need to be made before we're going to get anywhere close to protection. Is that right?
So the BP oil spill money runs out in 2030, I believe. And the reason,
roughly, I guess, yeah.
Yes. And we have been able to be aggressive with restoration protection projects and implementing the master plan because of those resources. But when those resources go away, there's not going to be the level of aggressive actions towards protecting our coast and rebuilding our coast. The reality, Lanny, is that the science is pretty clear. We know where the coastline will be once the temperature gets to 1.5 degrees, which in all accounts it will be there. We're already at 1. And most scientists that I speak with in the international realm are, of the understanding that we should be planning for 2 or 3 degree increase. Now, that new coastline will be right at Ascension Parish, but we just don't know when that will be because it depends on the rate in which the ice melts and the seas rise. When you look at the maps, post 2050 is when we see the really, really large shifts. And so when I think about our future coast, what I see is moving from more of a working coast to recreational coast, because it's just going to be impossible to live there full time with the amount of risk. We had Dr. Oppenheimer, who is one of the leading scientists and authors of the IPCC report and the cryosphere report that was released out of the IPCC. And he calculated how many days a year by 2050 Grand Isle will be underwater. And it was I think 256 days out of a year. And so, yeah.
Tell us what IPCC is.
Oh, I'm sorry. The International Panel on Climate Change. And this is the global consortium of scientists that produce the world's leading reports on climate change and really guide nations and agreements on what we can do to reduce emissions and keep the temperature. The goal has been to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which at this point, the globe isn't doing enough. Nations aren't doing enough. And so it's generally assumed that we'll surpass that. And so I think that for our future coastline, we've really got to think about where will people move? How can we be smart about that? How can we think strategically about that population movement into areas that need reinvestment and infill that could be thriving? I know in the Advocate, there's a lot of discussions around traffic congestion all the time. well, we should expect traffic congestion to continue and increase until we decide to build more density and create alternative modes of transportation. And with population movement, we could do that. And so I think, there's no silver bullet. Our coastline is dying, and we've got to use the resources, and the river diversions would be, very helpful in helping develop that buffer for us here in Baton Rouge.
It might be a good time to point out that Camille, you've been dealing with august company going to the Glasgow Climate Summit, and so forth. So CPEX's influence is being cast across the pond into the wider community of climate change.
Yes.
The Boo brought up a nice phrase that when we were all getting started in this sort of thing, we said, what was it? Think globally, but act locally.
Yeah.
Well, is there an act locally agenda that CPEX has been involved in to some extent from the very beginning? Walkable neighborhoods and so forth. How relevant is that going forward in the future, given these large climate challenges?
It's so interesting. Right after Katrina and Rita, and we got this wonderful funding called an earmark, we decided to take the lessons learned and go to all these communities throughout Louisiana and hold these workshops. Now, Camille did that. She spent how many years of her life, it felt like decades of your life within a year doing that. And what became so clear to us is that if you didn't change the policy at the local level, nothing happens. And so if you look, one of the things I'm very impressed by is this new watershed plan that HNTB is doing, and that they're coming out with all these recommendations and slowly making its way through the Metro Council and all of the people that have to approve it. But when you ask about specific issues that impact a local homeowner, they're not dealing with that because they're not at that scale yet. So CPEX has been looking at how policy, we made a huge shift at CPEX, and that's how we got involved in, like Camille was talking about, the lobbying. And we're realizing that you have to change laws at not just the local level, but at the state level. And the ones that were changed at the federal level didn't exactly work either. So, but it doesn't mean you stop trying. And so that's, I think, has been pushing CPEX and what has given us such stature with the work that Camille has done, because she is such an expert. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, although I think that there's kind of a disconnect in this discussion, I think, between the individual discussion of, well, if you build that new subdivision, my house is going to flood, and the fact that the land underneath your house is subsiding a bit, and that's a regular part of the threat to our coast. How do people mesh those two together? And that is a challenge for all of us, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so when you say mesh together, do you mean decision makers who are allowing for development in certain areas?
Yeah, well, and being better educated about the implications thereof. I've always said that Baton Rouge is only one levee break away from urban planning. But, we're still building a great deal of development on perfectly flat land behind the levees.
I'm grateful for the Louisiana Watershed Initiative's work on modeling and getting to the watershed level to understand the intricacies of the 8 large watersheds that have been carved out and how they have implications on one another. And I hope that those models are used at the local level to help inform land use decisions. And so I suspect that will happen here locally in Baton Rouge once the mayor's planning effort is done. And when we start looking and using science and data to make our land use decisions, then we'll develop quite differently. And when we have a plan that is based on that science and data and thinks about who do we want to be in the future, and then we map out how we get there through housing, transit, economic development, open space, recreation, we could have a very different future that my children could stay here. My grandchildren could stay here, or we could age in place here. So I do have great hope that we're on our way there, but we do need to set aside the political ambiguity around is climate change happening or not, and just accept that we're on the front lines and say, regardless, these are the weather patterns that we're having. We can see it. And let's plan for that. And I think about Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Boo, did you know Veronica Davis is now in charge of their transportation and development in Houston?
No. Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
I know. And so in Houston, there is not one transportation project, road project, that does not incorporate stormwater. They have completely merged them so that they're ensuring that water is managed as they're doing any road work, and they're also ensuring that complete streets and transit is part of the equation. And so I think we're going to see big shifts in Houston. This has been, part of the mayor's leadership in that city. And so we've got great examples how to turn this into a positive opportunity for more green space, more recreational space, and reducing flooding as we develop in the future, but it means developing differently.
Currently, if a developer wants to develop in the floodplain, our parish ordinances allow it. So, you can change people's minds, you can make them understand, especially when you look at our council meetings and people go and raise hell because they don't want another development. Look at the flooding it's causing. But the ordinance allows it. So when are we going to change the ordinance? That's the whole thing. And you take that and multiply it to how many communities we have in Louisiana and how many parishes and states that do all the same things.
Do we when you talk about changing policy, changing politics as well, part of that is intellectual infrastructure, and obviously Camille going, hobnobbing with the powerful at Glasgow is part of that. But also, is there enough of that intellectual infrastructure? Right after Katrina, we talked about the need for a more robust state planning process that would cut across the various state agencies. I don't know that has ever really occurred. To the extent it hasn't been along the lines of Houston making those kind of dramatic changes about how you do business day to day. Is that something that we should be pushing for?
Well, I'm
to
so
make
glad you asked that, because in Plan Baton Rouge, in the Louisiana Speaks plan, that was a huge issue. The number 2 thing, yes, we need an Office of State Planning. I think Camille has an update.
Yeah.
And wait, so that plan was completed was adopted in 2007. So how many years is this now later? Is 15?
Yeah.
15 years.
15
And
years.
what's happening thanks to this governor?
Yeah, so Commissioner Darden and Barbara Goodson have been huge champions for the need of a Office of Planning to be connected to the Office of Planning and Budget. And so after the pandemic, we were able to get an award from an EDA grant, and CPEX is currently partnering with the commissioner and Barbara to develop out a framework for an Office of State Planning. We just hired our first planning manager. There'll be 2 more positions, and we're developing the mission, the functions of that office right now, how it relates to the budget, how it relates to other agencies within the DOA, the Division of Administration, and other agencies across the state. But Lanny, I want to hone in on the point that you brought up, because in all of our research and all of our work, at the end of the day, for us to grapple with the massive challenges that are ahead of us around climate change, poverty, health, big economic shifts that are happening here, governance is key. There's so many factors that are out of our control that our governance structures are going to need to be rethought and redesigned to be able to respond to and proactively plan for what's coming and how we're allocating resources. I think the best example of a massive governance shift was after Katrina and the creation of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. Societal values shifted to say the coast is important to us, and the government responded, and combining parts of DNR and DOTD and creating the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. Our work is not done there. And I'll say from CPEX's perspective, we brought the governor and the cabinet together in 2018 for a 2-day workshop to look at how climate change impacts all of our state agencies, their functions, their mission. And out of that workshop, and there was a large awareness that, okay, we can't change sea level rise. We can't change the weather patterns. We can't, make drought go away. But what we found is how we set ourselves up and how we respond. And if we have good politics and good governance structures, that'll be our best case scenario. And so from that, there were 2 executive orders developed. One was in partnership with CPEX, creating a chief resilience officer and the adaptive governance initiative, which the governor appointed Charles Sutcliffe, and we've been working with him and resilience liaisons across every state agency to integrate a decision-making tool to help them integrate climate change data into their decisions around their services, but also their facilities. And then the second piece was an executive order to create the Climate Initiatives Task Force. And now we are the only state in the Gulf South that has a climate action plan, and many parts of it are already being realized. And so these are our 2 big shifts that are going to serve us very well as we try to compete for resources from the infrastructure bill, not only the infrastructure bill, but also the new Inflation Reduction Act, which is such a bizarre name.
Yes, indeed.
But those 2 things combined allow us to go after billions of dollars for our infrastructure, and the 4 pillars of those programs, of those resources set out by the Biden administration are climate first, equity first, workforce, and made in America. Which and so I think we have a lot of opportunities there.
Some years ago, I talked to the drafters of Governor Mike Foster's strategic plan for the state, which was a pretty significant document about how to rethink economic development and how you approach that from the state level. Well, one of the things, and I would think that they would tell you today, is that they did not appreciate how difficult it was to sustain these kind of initiatives through a change in administrations, and not necessarily because there was any evil intent on people's parts, but because it's just very difficult. And personnel change, to some extent, personnel is greater than policy in government. Is there a sustainability initiative to the sustainability initiative? And is that something that CPEX is going to be looking forward to in say 2024, when there is a new government structure in place?
Well,
Governors are term limited anyway in Louisiana. That's just one of the factors in how you develop policy.
before Camille gets into that, I'd like to just point out that when we did Louisiana Speaks and had such high hopes and all these things were happening and we could just see a new Louisiana coming, and then she didn't run again.
Mhm.
And then we had Governor Jindal, which actually we came up with all of the initiatives that needed to be covered, and we made a list and we looked at his platform, and oh my goodness, something like 75% of the items on our list were in his platform. So we said, oh, we're home free. Well, that didn't happen at all. There was no cooperation or influence used from the governor's office to make any of that happen. So I personally am worried about John Bell Edwards when he does go out of office. And so Camille, I know, is already thinking about that. And that's always about 10 miles ahead of 10 miles higher than all of us. So what are you thinking?
Well, what's great is, this governor and this administration, and I think about all the work happening, not only at CPRA, but at LED and within the DOA, and these shifts. And, there's so many people within the state that have ownership and vision and are making things happen every day. And even, and to Boo's point, remember, Boo, we actually did a lot of work with the general administration. We had Secretary Morey, where we worked closely with them, Secretary Ankner, and the Department of Transportation, which
Talk about a bicycle advocate.
yes, I mean he
Hey.
And then Garrett at that time was CPRA, and we did the Coastal Best Practices Manual and really worked closely with them. So I think we just have to get in early, whoever it is. We're going to work with whomever's there, because we're fighting for the future of Louisiana, and we're fighting for quality of life. And it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. We might have to start using different terminology. I don't know. But we're going to make it work. We're going to figure it out. And there's lots of people. We have so many partners across the state agencies that will remain there and will continue what this administration and the leaders in this administration have set forth. So I get asked this all the time by funders, and I'm just not as worried because we've got to carry on.
The necessities will still be there, and your role will still be there.
Yeah. And I mean, gosh, if it's so horrible, we might likely get more resources to combat the
Mhm.
So, but yeah.
But since we've been dancing down memory lane with Boo for about Plan Baton Rouge and so forth, as somebody who lives in downtown, and Camille, brought up the issues of poverty, which underlie so many of our difficulties in Louisiana.
Mhm.
One of the things that has always concerned me is this sense of the sense of the class distinction that is demonstrated, frankly, in the neighborhood where I live, where there's certainly just there's this belief, I think, and a tension to say that if you're going to live in an apartment downtown and live with the cool people, you have to have you have to be able to afford it, and you have to have significantly more money than the average family. And those are the kind of things that are going to be, I suspect, greater challenges going on because housing is such an inherently difficult issue.
Mhm.
A wise man who ran the National Housing Center once said, "Bottom line is that," he told me, he said, "Your bottom line is that poor people are poor and housing is expensive." Um, that that has frankly, a walkability component. That should not be the case for development, but isn't it really the fact that this is kind of something for the elites, the relatively well-off people to benefit from?
Do you want to take that, Boo, or I'll take a stab?
I'm supposed to ask hard-hitting questions. That was
Yeah,
what
no,
That was
Lyndon
a
told
hard
me
one.
to
You
do.
go
So
first and I'll go second.
well, you know, I'll go back to, I think we've got to be very honest about the role that poor planning or the lack of planning has played in creating many of the challenges we're facing today in Baton Rouge. Sprawl, congestion, like a lack of walk and bikeability, our climate change impacts, segregated neighborhoods, and communities suffering from decades of disinvestment. So poor planning decisions about how we design our transportation systems, how we develop our housing stock, allocate resources have contributed to these problems. And it's up to us to make better planning decisions for the future to reverse these harms. So how do we do that? We have got to be incredibly intentional if we want to do that. So in downtown, to the downtown question, you create more affluent or disinvested places by how we are allocating our resources and where we're putting our resources. So if we continue to sprawl out into new areas, it means disinvestment somewhere else. And so we've actually, I mean, Baton Rouge downtown is not the thriving, bustling downtown where everyone has an opportunity to live, work, and play that it could be. And if we want to get there, we've got to be incredibly intentional about how we get there and connecting it to more North Baton Rouge and LSU mid-city areas. But what I see happening is the focus is all on, a lot of focus is in South Baton Rouge and expanding that area.
a planner from AARP once said, American cities, not just Baton Rouge, but sprawling cities across the country, are going to be faced the issue of 70-something daughters driving their 90-something mothers all across
Yeah.
town, and that is going to be, if we think we have traffic congestion now,
Yeah.
wait until there are no alternatives for them to go to the doctor or do what they need to do. Boo?
We're seeing that already, aren't we, in Baton Rouge? I mean, the amount of congestion that this I-10 expansion is already causing is incredible. So I think, Camille's absolutely right that we have not taken the step of making development in the hinterlands or just beyond our borders any more expensive. And communities that have, I think Lincoln, Nebraska has, there are some that have actually said, no, if you develop outside the borders, then it's going to cost you twice as much. Well, a developer is going to think twice about that. If they have unlimited funds, they will do it. But see, Camille is so right. And I think just the disinvestment that you can drive today in neighborhoods in surrounding downtown and see where there is no investment. So the transportation issues are exacerbated to a point already that I can hardly believe.
Well, Congressman Graves, one of his comments was, we have the fourth worst congestion in the country.
Yeah.
And he said, think about how many enormous cities in this country are below us on that list. And the one or two that are above are like Los Angeles and so
And
forth.
Miami. Miami, Los Angeles, and New York. How are we number 4? I know. It's
But, if you look at this new bridge, which of course is going to be great, I'm sure it's going to be great. The issue, according to the experts, certainly not to me, from me, but Interstate I-1, excuse me, Interstate I-110 that comes from North Baton Rouge and squeezes down to one lane where it hits the traffic coming off the bridge. What are we doing to solve that? A new bridge is not going to help that. So what are we doing about Florida Boulevard? Are we making that more accessible? Are we looking at Airline Highway? I remember some visionary, there was a front cover of Business Report saying we ought to make Airline Highway limited access and have these service roads on either side, which of course is what Texas does all the time. That didn't go anywhere, but even Ankner, I think, like that. So are we doing anything? Is that even in the planning works right now?
And I think the question might be for Camille. Are we going to build, in other words, are we going to build our way out of this problem, really?
Well, so it took decades to get us here. It was massive investment in the 50s and 60s that led to the sprawling development patterns of today. And so I think we've got to think about our investment for the future and how we're going to use it to get out of where we are today and make smarter decisions that lead to a higher quality of life. And yes, we can get there over time. But again, it takes the power of planning, takes building champions, setting the table, really understanding the needs, and allocating resources and making those decisions to get there. So we just have, 2 massive bills that were passed by and signed by the president that can lead to a very different future and infrastructure for us. We've just got to see the opportunities and be smart. And I think building us out, I think about Florida Boulevard. So there's $4 billion in the 2 bills combined that are competitive resources for reconnecting disinvested communities. Any big infrastructure project that cut off and segregated neighborhoods is eligible. And Florida Boulevard is one such street that could be lifted up and applied for that bucket of funds. And I see great potential there for bus rapid transit, a smart corridor. It could be a thriving place again. And we just have to, all come around the table together and prioritize it and make it happen.
Well, remember in Plan Baton Rouge, it was 1998, and we were just beginning to expand I-10, that last big expansion, which Lanny, I don't remember exactly where it went from the split on. And Dewani looked at the plans, and Gladding Jackson looked and just laughed and said, okay, huge project. And he said, within 10 years, you're looking at another one. And he was absolutely right. That all the congestion was back. And that's what we keep doing, is thinking we're going to build our way out of this with more interstates. What we need is more interconnectedness, just like we need in our lives, in our personal lives. We need that with our highways and with our corridors and our alternate routes.
Yeah. So if we continue to widen roads for more cars, that's what we're going to get. And so, instead, if we think differently about how our infrastructure should serve all of us and not handicap us to vehicles, we could have a very different way of getting around and quality of life. In Baton Rouge, so when you think about livability and the cost of living in a place, you've got to combine housing and transportation costs. Those are the 2 biggest costs for a person. And in Baton Rouge, that's over 47% of your income.
And among the many nationally known people that Boo Thomas has worked with over the years, one of them was Jeff Speck. I think he did a book analyzing the fact that, frankly, when you need two cars in a working class family, you're inhibiting their financial future in a profound way. And he just kind of just did the math. And how many people in Baton Rouge are in precisely that situation today? So maybe Jeff had Baton Rouge in mind, Boo, when he wrote that. I don't know, but
he was part of Plan Baton Rouge.
Lots of American cities, yeah.
Yeah. We're getting on toward time. Do y'all want to deal with questions? If Landon could provide any or comments, respond to comments from the audience.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think Landon is still our producer and is still listening.
Yes. So we had one question from Passagen. As disasters are becoming ever more frequent and more impactful, are there plans to affect policy around recovery and rebuilding for greater sustainability, quality of life, and cultural
preservation? Every disaster, CPEX writes a letter on how we need to recover and what kind of resources we need to request and what the policies should be. And I'll just say, I think they're highly politically sensitive. And so I'm very proud of FEMA's change in focus, and this came in large part from a lot of our representatives, and I know Garrett was really big in leading this, is starting to think about preventative measures versus waiting for policy and resources after a disaster. But we've got to get real about the types of housing and building construction in certain areas. And I'm unfortunately, I think elevation is, just part of our future. And I know people prefer slab on grade, but there's just, we've got to get real about the current infrastructure and big policy changes around that. Elevating 2 feet above base flood elevation has generally been the rule of thumb. I think there's, little policies such as that. There's also obviously incentivizing and disincentivizing growth in certain areas. After Superstorm Sandy, you saw the governors of New York and New Jersey say, we are not building and rebuilding in certain areas. Now, I don't ever believe that's going to happen in Louisiana, but they've created some of the biggest buyout relocation programs. And New Jersey is just doing a phenomenal job. And so we've got to rip that Band-Aid off. We've got to have some of these hard conversations about where is it safe to live? And at what point can, we no longer put public infrastructure dollars into those locations? And this is highly politically sensitive. No one wants to touch it. But I think we've that's what CPEX is for. We do want to we have those hard conversations, and we advocate for such policies.
I don't think there's any question that the conversation around climate change has changed in Louisiana as storms have become so not only more virulent, but ramping up so quickly as say Hurricane Ida did, so that people are more concerned about what's going on beyond their immediate coastline, because the threats can come in so much more strongly.
Yeah.
Landon, any others?
We have a question from Bruce Morgan. He would appreciate further discussion on how the state will adapt to the new coastline, and his friends joke about how our houses will one day be oceanside resorts, and he wants to know how true or false this is.
So I believe that banks and insurance will be the driving factors of how we adapt to the coastline. It's already becoming market driven. There are areas that are people are slowly getting strangled out. Adaptation is means-based. If you have the means, you can get out of a situation at whatever point you're ready to. Everybody has a different tipping point. And what we see, and we work hand in hand with a lot of our coastal communities, but many are low income, and they rely on their social networks to survive. They've also been living off the land. And so it's incredibly difficult for a lot of our coastal communities to be able to have the means to go, because they just rely on that social system so much. And that land, their identity is tied to that land. But we are seeing people drop flood insurance, have been for a while. And, it's just a matter of time before, we've got more movement north. However, a lot of that land is turning into very affluent camps and second homes where people can not necessarily have to have insurance. And so this is what I meant by maybe moving more from a working to a recreational coast. This is my fear, that it won't be planned, that it'll be market driven, and a lot of people will get left behind. And to your question about when will the coastline be an Ascension parish, which is what the maps show. It depends on the temperature, how quickly we get to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and how quickly the ice melts to rise the seas. So, like I said earlier, if you look at the NOAA and the CPRA maps that use the high scenario, and the best science, post 2050 is when we will be very concerned. But there is also another tipping point and projected for 2030, 2035, where a lot more communities are going to be on the front lines, like we have been for a while. And the more communities in the United States that are on the front lines, the more resources that are spread thin. And it's going to be harder for Louisiana to make the case to continually receive resources. And that's why I'm so proud of our governor for leading the Climate Action Plan, because we're going to have to make the case that we're doing our part and being part of the solution. And so regardless of all that, I still have great hope for Louisiana's future.
All right, one last question. Are there centralized locations for municipal contracts to coordinate future planning initiatives?
Municipal contacts. Well, we have regional planning commissions across Louisiana that provide a lot of planning services to mayors and parish president and to parishes. And then CPEX, we're in 13 communities right now. We've worked in over 50, and we are invited into communities. That's something I learned from Boo. When we're invited in and the conditions are right, we are there. But there's also, the regional planning commissions that offer services.
And I can't help but think that one of the advances that is probably long overdue has been that watershed planning initiative that you were talking about earlier. The water in the Tensaw River Basin does not care that how many parishes or cities it goes through. But we need to plan it for that water in that given neighborhood. And frankly, people will have to be kind of driven to work together by the nature of those events. God knows we've seen plenty of flooding in Baton Rouge too, and it requires and apropos of the questioners, the gravamen, I think, of the questioner is are people going to be forced to work together? And I think that they are.
Yeah, I mean, if and we should be, because we won't get through this in a place that gets us to where we all would like to be, unless we are. And so, my background is in the sciences, and I learned a lot through osmosis, jumping into CPEX in 2007. But one thing I learned from Boo is you've got to create a tent, a very large tent, and you got to put everybody in it, even the people that you just don't even want to talk to and who are going to be, your adversaries and against you. And so when we set the table, and when we convene groups, and when we go into communities, we try to put all the voices around the table. Because, remember, Boo, the dairy farmers who were against all of our planning in Tangipahoa Parish were our biggest advocates at the end. And so I think everyone wants to work together. They just need to figure out how, and see a role for themselves, and where we're not, competing, we're collaborating.
And I think what has been so key to the success is we give people choices where they can see, if I do this, this is the outcome. If I do this, and that's the outcome. And so people are very intelligent and do know what they want. Most are intelligent. I saw that laugh.
Well, and even if they aren't intelligent, they can come into the tent.
Yeah.
I think that we're at an hour, so we should sign off. And as always, I think Camille, we're still learning from Boo Thomas and Will for a very long time.
Yes,
so.
our pinball champion queen.
That's a story that the listeners will have to get in on at a later date. But it's well worth waiting for.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lanny. Thank you.